I'll reintroduce myself. My name is Julie Lout. I work at the University of Illinois Press doing outreach and development work on behalf of the press, and we're very proud to be co-sponsors of this series of events this weekend. Before I turn it over to what I think is going to be a fantastic panel this afternoon on the impact of the Vietnam War era draft, I just wanted to mention, to remind you that for tomorrow morning, the two sessions that we have happening tomorrow morning, which are the book panel that Mike Metz will be chairing with people who are featured as interviewees for his book, as well as our keynote from Lael Hughes-Watkins on current efforts to archive student activism, will be taking place in Smith Memorial Hall, room 25, which is just across on the other side of the undergraduate library, and it's in the basement. So we will have signage and those things, but I just wanted to remind you that we won't be back here right away tomorrow morning. We'll be over there for those two events, and then back here for the last part of tomorrow afternoon. So without further ado, I think a few of our panelists will use the microphone, and if not, they'll speak up so that everybody can hear. So thank you.
I'm honored to have been asked to join these two quite brave and remarkable men as they tell their story. Part of my task will be to make sure they don't drone on, which they admitted to me is possible. So, and also because at some point we want to include everybody in the conversation, so eventually we'll open it up and I'll be the one who'll point. Okay? So the way we're going to do this is we thought it would be helpful for everybody to remember or to see what it was like that led them to make the decisions they made, to put things in a context, because, you know, with the passage of time, we can forget how potent and personal that era was, that led people to make decisions that would affect the rest of their lives. Steve Schmidt, who will also introduce himself, will set the context. Then Rick Soderstrom, who will introduce himself, will then talk about his story, and then we'll begin the conversation and it open up to all of you. So without further ado, Steve.
Okay, I am Steve Schmidt. I'm the guy on the right of the cover.
You haven't changed at all.
On the right. I haven't changed at all except the beard. Right, thank you.
You're welcome.
Patsy thought it would be good for those of you who might be under the age of 50 or 60 and for whom this is ancient history, if we had just a little bit of context of what was going on vis-a-vis the draft and the war that led up to Rick and I burning draft cards on the south patio of the Union in October of 1967. So very quickly, 62, Kennedy's president, and he's decided that what's needed in Vietnam is American military presence. But the official policy of the government in 1962 was secrecy.
At his news conference, President Kennedy draws a question regarding the virtual press blackout on military operations in South Vietnam.
We didn't have any combat troops in Vietnam. We had military advisors. So there were about 11,000 of them, according to the figures I've been able to find from the archives, but there's no precise number. What we do know is that there were 53 deaths of U.S. military personnel in Vietnam in 1962. This I get from my friends at the wall, the monument to the Vietnam War dead in Washington. Meanwhile, the Selective Service draftees between 62 and 63 have gone from 82,000 to a little over 119,000. Next year, 1964, now Johnson is president. Kennedy's been assassinated. Johnson is the president, and he wants more of the same because he's very much afraid. For some reason, that door seems to lock itself. He's very much afraid that the Republicans are going to attack him over who lost Vietnam in the same way that they attacked Truman over who lost Korea. So he wants more military presence, and he's getting a lot of conflicting advice, but he's basically defaulting to what the military generals are telling him. So 64, troop levels go up to a little over 23,000. Deaths go from 122 to 216. My eyes aren't so good, I have to look. And the draft levels continue to go up. 65, now Johnson pulls into the big escalation, rolling thunder.
We have learned at a terrible and a brutal cost that retreat does not bring safety. And weakness does not bring peace.
Now we officially have combat troops in Vietnam. The troop levels grew in 65 to 184,000 and some change. U.S. combat deaths are now 1,928. The draft levels go from 112,000 the year before to 231,000. So while we're cranking up the military presence, we have to support that with an additional cranking up of the draft. 1966, I graduated from high school that year. There were 385,000 and some change combat troops in Vietnam. The escalation is really going forward. The number of draftees is now over 380,000. The number of deaths in our combat forces in Vietnam is a little over 6,000. So again, it's more than doubling every year. 1967, the year that Rick and I meet out here on the quad for this draft card burning, things have gotten very interesting in 1965 because draft card burning as a protest of the war in Vietnam has become too popular, shall we say. The Congress passes a law making it a crime to burn a draft card. It goes to the courts. The Supreme Court rules that that is not protected speech because the military has a valid government purpose in having everybody carry a draft card. Well, that was the O'Brien case. It was decided by the Supreme Court by a 7-1 vote. Only Douglas was in dissent on that decision. So the court has, they've said something that's pretty seriously not in our favor for those of us who want to protest the war in Vietnam. The draft is a real obvious way to protest the war in Vietnam because all of us who are between the ages of 18 and 26 are required to carry that draft card. It's the direct link between our bodies and the military forces that are being shipped off to Vietnam to fight this war. You all know what a criminal war that is. I'm not going into that. What I'm going into is why this link between the civil disobedience of draft card burning, and now we know it's against the law, and are continuing to do that and to continuing to encourage many others to do that. Well, a lot of this comes out of the civil rights movement that we'd all been watching on television, reading about in the newspapers. How to use civil disobedience to get the public's attention to injustice. So 67, it's against the law to burn a draft card. Rick and I are standing out there to do that. 1967, as I said, the escalation of the war is going on. More people being shifted over there all the time, more people being drafted all the time, and more people dying over there all the time. Americans, Vietnamese, Cambodians, Laotians. The numbers are staggering. This continues on, as I think most of you know, for quite a few more years until finally, 1968, the troop levels reached over 500,000, about 543,000 and some change. Combat troops, one kind or another there. The combat deaths are almost 16,900. And the draft levels now are just under 300,000. And that's about the point when it breaks. Because 1968 also was, of course, the Democratic National Convention, the Nixon campaign against Humphrey, the almost disintegration of a lot of the Democratic Party. Nixon's got the Southern strategy. He's taking over all of the votes that are being cast in the Southern states. He's inheriting those from the old Dixiecrats, Strom Thurmond's efforts to forge a segregationist party. He's appealing openly to racism and all the rest of that. And I'm going to stop there because 69 was when I went to prison and I kind of got left out of a lot of the action that happened after that. But having laid all of that sort of groundwork, I'm going to let Rick talk about his experience in opposing the war, burning his draft card, and what he did after that. Go for it.
Is it working? Most of my involvement in the movement was with the civil rights organizations, and Starting in '63, I was involved with Friends of SNCC, which was a northern group working in support for the Freedom Riders and those fighting Jim Crow in the South. So that's where my involvement began. After my participation in the Selma to Montgomery March in the spring of '65, I was not emotionally prepared to continue my studies in civil engineering here at the university. I dropped out of school and I returned south to work with COFO, a civil rights group working on voter registration in Mississippi. While there, in order to report for my draft physical in St. Charles, Illinois, found its way to me. I successfully got the order switched from Illinois to Jackson, Mississippi. The night before my draft physical, I got a great idea for an ironclad excuse for not attending to my physical. But it was not without its risks. The automobiles used by civil rights workers were well known by the Jackson police, and the Jackson police were not our friends. Any real or imagined traffic violation would immediately put the driver in jail for at least a few days. I took a COFO car out for a drive through downtown Jackson, running every red light I encountered, slowly and carefully to avoid an accident. I did this for over an hour, but to no avail. The police must have all been in the donut shop. I finally gave up, went back to my house, resigned myself to my fate. The next morning I showed up as ordered for my physical and was told I could leave because my paperwork had not yet arrived from Illinois. I returned to the U of I in the fall of '65 and got my 2S deferment back. Do you all understand these deferments and student deferments and all that? In 1966, I was becoming progressively more militant against the draft because of my growing opposition to the war. I joined the Draft Resistors Union and started writing a series of belligerent letters to my local draft board. I sought conscientious objector status, but shortly thereafter conceded that I was not opposed to all wars, but I was certainly opposed to the Vietnam War. I told the board they had no right to my body, that I had no intention to participate in the war, that if I fought the Viet Cong or the North Vietnamese, I found them to be equally and morally reprehensible as to the U.S. But if I was forced to fight in that war, I would rather fight on their side. In response, my draft board gave me the coveted 4F certification, physically, mentally, and morally unfit for service. Who knew? In '67, I again dropped out of school and started working full-time at the Department of Civil Engineering. A group of us were building computer systems to automate the process of structural engineering. This was the early stages of what became CAD/CAM. Another draft resistor at Illinois, Dennis Weeks, had already spent 18 months in federal prison for a felony conviction for refusing induction several years earlier. He was now out of prison and a student at the U of I. The Army does not take felons, except felony of refusing the draft. The local board was on a path to draft him a second time. Dennis had planned to burn his draft card with Steve Schmidt, but decided to back out. And I remember thinking that he had chickened out. Chickened out. After he had spent time in prison. And then, what had I done that gave me the right to call him a chicken? Sitting on my 4F. I had just snookered myself. And that is how I ended up on the steps of the Student Union with Steve Schmidt. A slightly different a slightly different view of the draft card burning, picture of the draft card burning than the one you saw on the cover there. By the way, I'm the handsome one. This picture occurred in the fold-out page of the Chicago Tribune the day after. Almost everyone in Illinois, especially my draft board members in St. Charles, saw that picture as they drank their morning coffee. That very day, my draft board met and reevaluated my status. My 4F classification quickly morphed into a 1A, but not just 1A, but 1A delinquent. 1A is at the head of the line. 1A delinquent is the head of the line. My name was guaranteed to be included as part of the St. Charles Draft Board's next Selective Service quota, and yes, it was. Not long after I received my order to report for induction at St. Charles at 6:30 a.m. Me, age 24, and about 30 19-year-olds. All of us, too slow, too stupid, too honest, too loudmouthed, too principled, or just plain unlucky to avoid the draft. I came prepared, and I handed out leaflets on the hour-long bus ride to the induction center. The leaflets were ignored. The other draftees spoke a little, had glazed eyes, much like the other traffic going in Chicago through our town was trucks filled with cattle. And the steers had the same look on their faces that the steers did. The induction center was a full floor of a block square building in the Loop. Each day, hundreds, maybe thousands of young men were run through the induction assembly line. The whole place is a bit like a big IKEA store. Well, you wound your way through various stations. At the first station, you removed all your clothing except your underwear, stored your clothes in a locker, and carried a paper bag with your valuables and a glass bottle containing your urine sample. Groups of 10 recruits progressed through the various stations, staffed by Army medical workers. It was a very noisy affair with measurements and observations yelled to clerks sitting at tables with pens and rubber stamps, updating each recruit's paper record, shadowing them from station to station. Urine sample, blood test, eye exam, hearing exam, mouth and teeth exams, muscular and motion exams, and at one station, the ultimate indignity. You were instructed to stand on a line on a numbered spot, to drop your drawers, and to bend over and spread your cheeks. Most completely understood those instructions, but some reached for their faces. The physician walked behind the row of men who were bent forward and would yell out things like, "External on number 8," while the clerk grabbed the appropriate stamp and pounded on the draftee's record. The last stage was not a row of cash registers like IKEA, but a ceremony room complete with the U.S. Army flags and U.S. government flags, and a line drawn down the middle of the floor. But there, like in IKEA, a price was to be paid. After dressing, the draftees entered that room, 20 or so at a time, as freemen, crossed the line, exited as recruits in the United States Army. On entry, you were subjected to the laws of the land, protected by the U.S. Constitution. On exit, you were subjected to the Uniform Military Code. The number of rights and freedoms you had were suddenly and severely reduced. In my physical, I played with the buttons on the hearing test. You just didn't do any good. I tried to be disruptive, but I was not having a detrimental effect on the process. It was becoming apparent that a single person would not have meaningfully accomplished much while in the Army. The inductees were too scared to do anything but follow the instructions yelled at them. I carried my leaflets in my valuables bag, and when I tried to hand them out, I was culled from the herd and taken through the process alone by an articulate first lieutenant graduate of Howard University. As Howard led me through the stages of the physical, we had a chat about progress in the civil rights movement and the conduct of the war. Older people remember the Group W bench. in Alice's restaurant. Chicago had such a place, and I ended up there because of my arrest record. But they were not impressed with my crimes, all nonviolent misdemeanors related to civil rights demonstrations. At the end of the line, I dressed, and while chatting with Howard, he finally said, "Are you ready?" "Ready for what?" "Well, we're going to take you in," he said. They brought me into the ceremony room. There were no other inductees, just several Army officers. One of them had me stand behind the line, and he read through the induction ceremony and finally asked me to take a step forward to cross the line. I stood motionless. Again, he asked me to step forward, and again, I stood motionless. I half expected someone to push me from behind, but that didn't happen. The whole procedure was repeated from the beginning, and more requests to step forward, and finally I stood motionless. Howard asked me to come with him. We left the ceremony room and went to an office. We were talking, but nothing was happening. I began to get paranoid and worried that they were waiting for the FBI to come and pick me up. But that didn't happen. I finally asked Howard if there was any reason that I was still there, and he said no. So I said goodbye, left the building, stopped at the first bar, ordered a double Jack Daniels, finished it, returned to my parents' home, and then back to Champaign. In late October 1967, thousands of people from all over the country came to Washington and marched across the Potomac Bridge to the Pentagon. Some of you probably were there. We were there to demonstrate our opposition to the war. Some hundreds of us outflanked the soldiers who had been called out to guard the building. We scaled the wall and made it to the upper level courtyard. The soldiers regrouped and surrounded us there. We sat down and a standoff began. The soldiers had a circle around us. They had rifles, and they stood facing us with the rifles butt down. We sat with our backs to the soldiers and their rifles. And then people would get up and make speeches. And one guy started talking about the goons that were there guarding us. He was thankfully shouted down. I never had a problem with the soldiers. They were just like me. They were my age. They were Americans like me. They were products of the war just like I was. So at one point, I lifted my head. It's very uncomfortable because the soldier's rifle was sticking into my back, and after about half an hour of this thing sticking you on your backbone, it gets uncomfortable. So I looked up, and with all the activity going around, nobody else could hear what we were talking about, well, what I was talking about. And I said, "If I move an inch forward, will you move an inch back?" And he did, and I did. And we didn't say another word. But that was one of the more poignant moments for me in the anti-war time. I decided to go to Canada. I couldn't understand what purpose I would serve in jail, and Steve can tell his side of that decision. I was in the middle of a project at work, one I cared a lot about, and I wanted to get that to a logical stopping point in that effort. I had learned that the FBI would take at least 6 months before they got around to looking for me, and I stayed working in Champaign-Urbana for several months. I didn't really hide. I continued seeing friends on the campus. In March '68, a few of us took a trip to Toronto and Montreal to see what Canada was like and to make connections with the anti-war groups there. Back in Champaign, I sold all my stuff, left my apartment, and slept on the couch at Vince and Charlotte Wu's. Thank you. Where are you? Charlotte? Vince? Where's Vince? There he is. Thank you for putting me up. I didn't actually tell anyone else where I was living. My mother wanted to know how to reach me. I told her the FBI would come to the house one day, and I did not want her to be put in a position of lying about my whereabouts. She told me she would never tell anyone where I was. I told her I would call her regularly. I was the youngest of 7 children, 6 of them boys. My oldest brother fought in Germany in 1945. The other 4 all served in the military. None of my family were happy about what I did, but I was not disowned. My sister was the most upset about what I had done. My boss was a professor at the university, as well as a colonel in the U.S. Army Reserve. He and I respected and admired each other's work. One day he took me in his office and told me that he had been talking with his buddies in the Army. And he said that he thought he could work out a deal where if I submitted to the draft and agreed to go to basic training, he would arrange that I would be assigned to West Point, doing computer science research for the duration of my conscription. I was honored by the offer, but told him that I could not accept it. I fully appreciated the offer because it actually extinguished any thoughts I had hidden in the back of my own mind that I was afraid of the war, afraid of going to fight. I eventually wrapped up my work, put together a stake of about $1,000 US, and Lenore Tenenblatt drove me from Champaign to Toronto in her Porsche 911.
Wow.
A Porsche is a lovely car, but it has somewhat deficient when it is a moving van. So I arrived in Toronto with one small suitcase and a list of anti-war contacts. I said goodbye to Lenore on Queen Street in Toronto. In Toronto, I stayed at a flop house of American exiles, draft dodgers, deserters, and other misfits. It was run by a sympathetic American expat couple. Within a month, I had landed a job at the University of Waterloo in Kitchener, and I bought a beat-up old Volkswagen microbus. I had the circular VW emblem on the front of the bus changed to a peace sign, and I settled into an apartment in Kitchener. A previous girlfriend of mine from the U of I, Nancy Goodwin, was at the University of Waterloo for summer school, and we rekindled a relationship of convenience for the summer. On the spur of the moment, Nancy and I decided to return to Illinois for a long weekend. The FBI had not been to my parents' house. I thought it was probably pretty safe. At Detroit, on our way back to the U.S., I was questioned by the U.S. immigration officer about my citizenship. I told him I was an American, and he asked to see my draft card. I said I didn't have one. He asked why. I said I burned it. He had me park my van and come into the office. Nancy was now very scared. Surprisingly, I was actually quite calm. When we went into the office, he stood behind a counter and he said, "When a duly authorized representative of the United States government asks you to produce your draft card and you are unable to do so," at this point, he reached under the counter, pulled out a piece of paper and placed it on the counter and continued, "He can fill out this form." He then filled out a page-long form ending with the writing, "Says he burned it." He then had me sign it and then told us we could go. We drove to the University of Illinois, had a great weekend with our friends, stopped by my parents' house to fill in my microbus with all my worldly possessions on our way back to Waterloo. I told my parents I was going to be completely safe in Canada when the FBI came. They could give my address and my phone number in Canada. I did not return to the U.S. for 7 years. I had frequent unpleasant dreams of sneaking back across the border and getting caught and put in the slammer. At the end of the summer term, Nancy left to return to Illinois. I was now, really for the first time, totally alone. In late August, the Democratic National Convention was held in Chicago. I was glued to the television, watching every single minute. All my friends back in Illinois being beaten and tear gassed by Mayor Daley. and his henchmen there in Chicago as they demonstrated against the war. I miss them all greatly, and I miss being part of the action. That was probably the loneliest week of my life. It took me a while to get used to Canada and Canadians. In most ways, they are pretty much like Americans, but the differences are subtle. They are lower key, less brash, and less anxious to start a conversation with a stranger. Politically, the mean is shifted slightly to the left. Approximately 2 months after my return to Waterloo, I received a letter from a local draft board in Detroit, Michigan, that said they had reason to believe that I was in violation of the Selective Service Act and that I should register with them as soon as possible or face possible prosecution. I received word from my parents that the FBI had come to the house. My mother answered the door. 2 men in suits showed her their badges and asked about my whereabouts. She responded, "I am a Christian woman and I will not lie. I know where my son Richard is, but I will not tell you." At this point, my dad came to the door. "What's going on, Leah?" "These men are from the FBI and they're looking for Ricky." My dad said, "Oh, he's in Canada. I'll get you his address and phone number." I still get choked up every time I tell this story. I'm so proud of both my parents. I caused them great hardship, and they never stopped loving me. I received word, I missed that section. Oh, no, I read you about Dennis Weeks. Dennis, yes, indeed. I received word from Dennis Weeks that he had indeed been drafted a second time. This time he went to Vancouver. We corresponded a bit and then lost track of each other. I do not think him a chicken. After 3 years living mostly in different cities, I met my future wife Bobby in the fall of 1968. She's a true Canadian, born in Moose Jaw, Saskatchewan.
Hooray for you, Rachel.
Well, I did win the lottery.
Sure did.
After 3 years of living mostly in different cities, Bobby and I married in January 1971, moved to Ottawa, where we have lived for close to 48 years. 14 months later, our first child, Daisy, was born, and with the newborn baby, Bobby flew alone to Chicago, where she met my family for the first time and introduced our baby to my parents. Wow. The end of the war in Vietnam. When the Vietnam War ended, I learned from some that had been drafted because of their political views. And I learned a lot more from Steve, by the way, in the last day about what really went on with this. That they had challenged their arrest warrants and had been winning the cases. I retained a lawyer in Chicago who specializes in this. He got my file from the draft board and thought it was a doozy. He was certain that if I returned to challenge the charges, the government would back down, and if they didn't, they would lose badly in court. I received an open-ended leave of absence from my place of work and made plans for Bobby, who was then very pregnant with our second daughter, our daughter Daisy, who was 2, and me to fly to O'Hare Airport, where I would turn myself into the forewarned FBI. A few days before the trip, I was told by the Chicago lawyer not to come. The federal prosecutors were reviewing the cases of induction, refusal, and dropping charges in most of them. My lawyer thought my case would be dropped, but the prosecutors were not keeping him informed of the status. He advised me of the phone number of the federal prosecutor. I called him and found out that charges against me had been dropped 2 days earlier. Even better, about a month later, I received a letter from my local draft board in St. Charles, Illinois, informing me that the order to report for induction some 7 years earlier was now rescinded. Later that year, Jimmy Carter gave a blanket amnesty to all Vietnam War resistors, both the draft dodgers, deserters, people like Steve, who was, I guess, neither. I took special pleasure in the fact that I needed no amnesty. I'm not proud of what I've achieved, destroying Jim Crow. I'm also proud of my contribution to the ending of the war in Vietnam and achieving free speech on university campuses, a fight that apparently is not yet over. I do not regret immigrating to Canada. I'm proud of my life, marriage, and career, and children Bobby and I have made together in Canada.
The impact of the Vietnam War draft was profound in many ways, and it was meant to be. The draft, as it was set up, was meant to affect all of the able-bodied male population who were under 30 in ways that kept them focused on things that the government approved of and avoiding things that the government didn't approve of. What do I mean by that? One of the things that we used in our propaganda in the anti-draft movement in the 60s was a document entitled Channeling. And what it talked about was the way in which the draft, through its system of deferments, student deferments, deferments for being married, deferments for having children, deferments for being a minister or a ministerial student, all of these, and deferments for being disabled physically or whatever, the Group W bench group. It allowed the government to keep track of us all, to make sure that we were doing what they liked, being good students, working in defense plants, being married, having children, doing all those things that marked us as good citizens, and not doing things that they disapproved of. So how was that working in my life? Well, my older brother, who's a year older than I am, had been a student, University of Nebraska, while I was finishing up high school. He didn't do so well in school and dropped out. And of course, he immediately went from having a 2S student deferment to being eligible for being drafted. But he was a clever guy. He knew that being drafted meant that he would go to the Army, and that meant that he might go to Vietnam. So he volunteered. That's the other way in which the Selective Service system was designed to work. It was designed to work that there would always be a ready body of people who would volunteer for the Air Force, for the Navy, for something, for the National Guard, something that might keep them out of combat. And so he volunteered for the Air Force. And by the time I was ready to participate in the draft card burning activity in October of '67, he was at the Tonsonet Air Force Base outside of Saigon. And his first assignment there was loading coffins onto the planes to send them back to the States. So it's kind of the way in which it was designed. It made the military and your susceptibility to being drafted into the military immediate and personal. And that meant that your political reaction might very well be immediate and personal. It meant that you might make decisions in your life that weren't necessarily the things you wanted to do, but the things that you did in order to maintain your deferment place with the Selective Service system, or if you couldn't avoid that, you might be leaving the country, you might be engaged in active civil disobedience. There are a lot of things you might be doing that you wouldn't otherwise have been doing if it hadn't been for the draft. The impact of the draft in the Vietnam era was dramatic and almost universal among that 18 to 26 age group. Now, one of the things that Rick touched on was, well, what happened? How in the world did this system that seemed to be working out so well, certainly giving the Army all the volunteers they needed, and where they needed more manpower, they were getting them through the draft. But the system was beginning to break down because there were a critical number of people who were willing to resist it actively, who were willing to say no when they were ordered to induction. The day that Rick and I stood out here on the quad and burned draft cards, there were about 10,000 other people around the country doing the same thing. And for the rest of 67 into 68, and especially into 69, those numbers grew dramatically. When the Osterreich case was argued before the Supreme Court, and that was the case that began to open the door for me and for Rick and people like us who were in that situation, the court ruled essentially that a person who had had his deferment for being a student in a seminary taken away because he had participated in a protest against the draft and the war, and it was given instead a 1A delinquency as a classification. The court ruled that they just had no, that is to say, Selective Service System, his draft board, had no legal grounds for doing that. And so one of the things that I was beginning to learn in 67 and early 68 was the importance of lawyers. Thank God for them, because it was the lawyers that helped us to bring this thing finally to ground. In the same way that it was the lawyers that helped us to get the Voting Rights Act enforced, that helped us to get the Civil Rights Act of 64 enforced. Now, it took a lot of courage on the part of civil disobedient protesters in the South and in the anti-war movement to force the issue, but it was the lawyers that really did it. By the time that the Gutnick case hit the Supreme Court, it was decided in January of 1970. Gutnick was a person who had been a student at University of Wisconsin. He had burned his draft card the same day that Rick and I did up in Wisconsin. He was also reclassified 1A delinquent, put up at the top of the list for induction. He also refused induction. So he's on there along the same path that I was on. He had a better lawyer, though, in the district court. And by the time it got to the Supreme Court, like I say, the case got decided in early 1970, so this is well over 2.5 years later after he had burned his draft card. Michael Tiger, the lawyer, comes from the University of Southern California Law School, gets a special dispensation to argue before the court because he'd never done it before. The first thing that he says in the oral argument is he draws attention to the court to the fact that draft cases are now 10% of federal prosecutions nationally. The numbers are astounding. There's tens of thousands of people who are lined up to be prosecuted in one way or another for their resistance to the draft. The power of that mass protest, combined with clever lawyers, is what helped undermine the Selective Service system. And I think it's why, although there is still a Selective Service system, and all of our kids, when they turned 18, were forced to go register for it, and kids like my son, who's 24, still has to carry that draft card around, there's no draft. And what I think that impact has meant since then is that the military, the executive branch, have to be very much more circumspect in what they can try to do to enforce whatever it is that they want to enforce, whether it's in Grenada or Afghanistan or Iraq or wherever. They have to be much more circumspect because they cannot go forward and try to take large segments of the population and draft them into the military, or use that kind of a channeling system like they did in the 50s and 60s to make sure that the American people are doing what the government wants them to do. Now, so the last person that was drafted under Selective Service was in June of 1973. The U.S. Army makes a big propaganda point. They have a whole thing on a website about this person. Drafted into the Army at 19 in 1973, retired from the Army, stayed in it the rest of his adult days, so to speak. They think that's terrific. All right, well, it's a choice that he made. He didn't have to stay, he did. But now the question is, we still have a selective service, but we still have a case that was argued in a district court in Texas very recently. The National Coalition for Men sued the Selective Service system. Why? It discriminates against men, doesn't include women. The district court judge said, you're right, it's unconstitutional. What's going to happen next? Are they going to require women to register for the draft? Your guess is as good as mine. But if people are paying attention to that, we won't have a Congress that will go ahead and make that kind of an extension to the Selective Service system. If people are paying attention to that, then it won't go against us. For those of us who think that war is not a solution to anything. That's why we need a State Department that functions. That's why we need an opposition to war as a solution to political and social problems. How these kinds of things can explode, and that's certainly what happened with the anti-war, anti-draft movement. It just, as long as the government was willing to keep escalating the war, we would keep escalating the opposition. And we would try to do it with the biggest numbers we could mount. And where I think that some elements of the anti-war movement went right off the track was saying, well, they're going to visit violence upon us, we'll visit it back on them. There's no way you can match that level of violence. Don't even think about it. That's a serious mistake. Socially, politically, it's a serious mistake. That was my point of view. I know that Mark Rudd and Bill Ayers and some others might even to this day argue that, but I think that's pretty clear. So my point of view was always, you protest as much as you can, you oppose them in every way you can think of, as long as it's not violent, because that's a game you can't win. And it confuses the message. You got to keep the message as clear as you can. Because if everybody in the country understood what you were trying to say, you wouldn't have to do it. You've got to be very clear, clear as you can anyway, about the connections between the draft, the channeling effect of the whole Selective Service system, the uses of the military that are legitimate and illegitimate. And what was going on in Vietnam was as illegitimate as anything that's been done in recent American history.
But I never felt any doubt about what you were going to do. You seemed totally unafraid about burning your draft card, which was amazing to me. Did you have doubts, or were you committed completely through the process?
Well, no, I didn't have any doubts. I was very clear in my mind what I was doing, why I was doing it, and how my small effort was connected to a bigger effort, and how that bigger effort was probably the only way that we were going to be able to have any kind of impact on the course of the prosecution of the war. So, yeah, there's a film and a book. The title of it is Ordinary Heroes. And it's about Joan Trumpauer Mulholland. I don't know if any of you know her. She was one of the very first people out of Duke University to engage in sit-in demonstrations in the South with SNCC. There was a sit-in Selma, and she is the freckled-haired, red-headed kid at that lunch counter. She was, she must have been arrested 100 times, maybe more, in Mississippi and Alabama mostly. She was the person who was at the phone in Washington, D.C. when the bus was burned, when they were doing the freedom rides. and they called back to headquarters to say, the bus has been completely destroyed, everybody's been beaten up, and taken off to jail. What do we do now? She called Diane Nash in Nashville, and because the Nashville was a real center of that kind of opposition to what was going on within the South. And she and Diane Nash from Nashville, a bunch of other people from Nashville, and Stokely Carmichael and Marion Barry from Washington, D.C., they all got on planes. And they flew to New Orleans, which was supposed to be the terminus of the Freedom Ride. It was going to go from Washington, D.C. to New Orleans to test whether the federal government would enforce the Civil Rights Act, whether or not the rulings that could come out of the courts about segregation in interstate transportation being against the law of the land, whether that would be enforced. So they flew to New Orleans and they got on buses going in the other direction. And when they got to Selma, well, guess what happened? Same thing. They, got pulled off the buses, they got beat up, they got taken off. Now, in Jones' case, they got taken off not to the county jail. Those were all full. They got taken to Parchman Prison, which was where death row was, for the state prison. And they were in a cell that's about from here to that wall from the death row cells. And they were there for months because they refused bail. Now, those people are really committed people, and the principle that they're fighting for is just. Well, that's a model. I can pick up on that, and I think we all eventually did. We understood what was going on. And maybe I got there. One of the things, I was laughing with Rick about this at lunch. In 1967, October, I had just turned 19. I was a kid, Maybe I didn't have enough view of what, a more mature person was supposed to think about that. But to me, it was very clear. It was very simple, And what we were doing was a simple, clear response to what was going on with the whole Selective Service system, the military buildup, and the war in Vietnam. They were all one part of a piece.
I saw the Ken Burns, and I was astounded because it said everything that I knew happened and even more. The facts, when they finally came out. Sometimes when I'm reading leftist propaganda, I know that maybe this isn't quite true, and some of the stuff I have read isn't true. Everything I read about Vietnam in that period of time that was leftist propaganda was the honest to goodness truth. So.
There was a question. Somebody raised their hand. Yes, in the back. Oh, Vern.
I want to know the name of that book. I couldn't hear it. The book you referred to.
It's called An Ordinary Hero. An Ordinary Hero. And it's the story of Joan Trumpauer Mulholland. She was an ordinary hero. She was one of, lots and lots, thousands of people who were doing this, doing what they could do. What she says about, oh, by the way, she lives about 8 miles from me. She's in Arlington County. So we've had some conversations face to face. And what she says is that, what we were doing was the best thing that we could think of to do to attack social injustice in the South. She says to me, what you were doing was the best thing you could think of to do to attack injustice around the war in Vietnam. And then she says, and we're getting old now. Maybe the best that we can do is to have the backs of the kids that are out there now around guns, around climate change, around all the issues that they are confronting and trying to work out how to respond to. Good idea. I like it.
One thing that was said I don't agree on is what I did, and I think even what you did in this burning our draft cards and taking the consequences was less risky and perhaps less glorious or heroic than what the Freedom Riders did.
Oh, absolutely.
I just wanted to make that clear.
Absolutely.
They were facing death. I mean, I can remember at least
Yeah.
twice a week getting the story of another lynching.
Yeah,
And
yeah, absolutely.
because
Absolutely.
I was on the desk at SNCC, receiving all these
Right.
lynchings were quite common.
At that time, we all listened to 3 stations for our news. So everybody in America was hearing the same news. You may walk away from it with a different point of view, but we're all getting the same information. Now, with the proliferation of news stations that are 24/7, you can listen to the news that speaks to you. And I think that very much puts a damper on the possibility of social movements, because it makes us much more tribal in our way of seeing the world. I don't know, does that speak to you at all? Does that resonate?
Well, I think we all see that. I have relatives who, are Rush Limbaugh fans. I have relatives who are, fans of National Public Radio. That's a big gap. I have fans who are way to the left. I have family who are way to the left of National Public Radio. That's, yeah, but it's always been like that in a sense, because yes, we all saw ABC, NBC, CBS, and National Public Radio didn't come into existence until the 70s, so it wasn't around. But in the pre-internet age, there were newspapers. And newspapers had definite biases. Well, that was part of what newspapers came into being for. That's why so many of them are called the blank, blank, blank Democrat or the blank, blank, blank Republican. They were organs of political parties, many of them. And, you read the newspapers in the 60s from Birmingham or Atlanta or Dallas or New Orleans, and their slant on everything in the news is very different from the New York Times or the Boston Globe or the Chicago Sun-Times. But you don't have to make it that big. The Chicago Sun-Times and the Tribune were about as far apart as you could get.
Counterpoint, or perhaps it's a complement to that. Not only the difference in the way information is spread out, despite our view that social media will change the world in a particular way and allow for social movement and change, that we're becoming more tribal, not more community-oriented. And the other thing that happened, I think, as a result, this is the world according to me, Woodstock happens, 500,000 people show up, and corporate America goes, oh my God, these are people we can sell shit to. And from then on, the movement all social movements become co-opted. And to that point, I will tell you, I was recently in Paris, and I take a picture of a t-shirt that says, sisterhood is powerful. And I'm thinking, feminism, fabulous. The t-shirt is in the window of Dior and costs $900. That's what's happened. We didn't have that facing us, because at that point, corporate America was still naive enough to discount this minority. And we were in a position, we could tell who our brethren and sisters were, right? Because we could tell by the way you dressed or the way, there was that kind of connection then that corporate America has stolen from us. So it's not just, it's in partnership with the government.
The Lawyers Guild, the ACLU, the folks that take the states to court around Planned Parenthood issues and try to defend Planned Parenthood clinics, all of those progressive organizations are under attack at the federal level, but maybe more importantly at the state level. They need help. And, I'm in a position to help them with money. I'm not a lawyer. I can't help them with that. Send them money. It doesn't have to be a lot. Just try to do it on a regular basis. They need it.